Hello, Lorcana YouTube community. I know over the past month my YouTube channel has been more quieter than usual, but I do have a good reason for that. Life and personal priorities took center stage, but in between everything, I was still deep in the lab working very hard to refine my Sapphire Steel Set 7 deck. It was crucial finding the right strategy to ensure that this deck can stand strong against the dominant Ruby Steel builds that are currently in the meta right now, and after a lot of adjustments and testing, talking to some other high-skilled Sapphire and Steel players, I think I finally cracked the code and found a well-optimized deck list, very powerful, that can counter these current decks in the Set 7 meta. After all the dedication and effort I put into refining my list, it all paid off in a huge way. I had the chance to travel to Austin, Texas with a group of friends to compete in a 1K tournament hosted by Castle, where I landed a second place finish with the top 4 split using my updated Crab Rave deck. In this video, I'll be breaking down the deck with an in-depth profile and guide, going over tech choices and pretty much my strategy that I use to adapt to the new Set 7 meta. If you haven't subscribed already, please go ahead and hit that sub button. It definitely means a lot to me and it helps the channel grow. Also, don't forget to leave a like and a comment. Let me know what you guys think of the video, and let's go ahead and get into it. I also want to give a shout out to my locals, the Stronghold Games, for sponsoring me for this event. I was able to travel with my friend Josh and Mark, and me and Mark actually secured a top 8 finish as well, and our friend Josh bubbled out at 9th place. I also want to shout out the people at Castle. They were super awesome, super welcoming, and I do recommend for anyone that does travel to Austin to go ahead and check them out. Let's get started with the deck guide, deck list. I will have timestamps and my matchups down below in the description if you do want to check that out. But pretty much this is my updated Crab Rave deck. I know about a month ago is when my last upload, when I did have this first draft of my Sapphire and Steel deck, and since then, I actually do like where the meta has shifted, and I like where this deck is headed. I know right now there are multiple Sapphire and Steel builds that you can use right now, like Kiwi, items, New World, no New World. It's a lot. But I think right now you really have to pick a deck that can combat the heavy Ruby Sapphire decks and also all the Steel decks. You have Amber Steel, Green Steel, you have Blue Steel. So you really need to make sure you have a very strong opening into both of those type of decks and then finish off the game as always with a lot of lore. I think the main thing that makes this list better than all these other lists, or at least for my personal opinion, is because I always like how Sapphire Steel could be a toolbox deck rather than having an aggro approach. We're going to have a lot of tools and answers that we can use in the mid and late game, and as always have a very strong early game as well. The main key engines in this deck are going to be always your turn 2 and turn 3 combos. So you have the Chicha and the Quill line to go against Ruby decks, or in the mirror match you can always fall back to Hawkins instead, or other Sapphire and Steel decks. I think Chicha is super strong into Ruby decks because you're always able to keep cards in your hand and they're just forced to answer it. And then with the card like Hawkins, that's just super strong. Every time you double ink, he can get to 4 attack, and that can pretty much attack over Alice's, Daisy's, opposing Scrooge. The 4 willpower, 4 strength right now is very crucial in the meta, and Hawkins plays a huge role in that. And then of course you have your Belle for your turn 1 against any aggro approaches, super strong. And as always, we finish off the game with, again, big lore amount with Lucky Dime and Tamatoa. Now I'm going to go over each card one by one, go over why I think it's really good in the deck and the flex spots that you could use if you didn't want to use that card. So we're going to start off with Chicha. Chicha, we're playing 3 copies of it, and as I mentioned earlier, into Ruby is just very strong. I think turn 2 is very important, and compared to other Sapphire and Steel lists that focus more on turn 2 ramp like Tipo, plus having Cell, I think that strategy is very strong, but I do think that it kind of falls weak sometimes into red-blue, just because if you do ramp into a crab, yes, the strategy is to get them to have to answer your threats, but I feel like you just run out of gas. And I think being able to play Chicha on turn 2 slows them down a lot, especially if they're on the play and they play a Sapphire Coil. Now they're forced to brawl, and then on their turn 4, they still haven't done anything. And if they want to hire them, they didn't put a popsicle, they're going to have to pop that coil. Either way, Chicha still has to be answered with. And if they ignore the Chicha, you can set up a Quill the following turn, plus Hiram, plus Visions, and now you can get to Tamatoa, Big Tamatoa, and start dropping big amount of lore on the board. I think in that matchup you do have to focus on draw power and the big Tamatoa rather than the small one, and having the small one more to refill your hand later in the game. If you didn't want to play Chicha, then I would suggest playing Tipos instead to have that ramp. But I think, again, Chicha right now, if you're going to a tournament and half the room is on Ruby Sapphire, it is very strong. Yes, against some steel decks, you might see it as being a bad option because it can get targeted by other removal spells. But obviously, in those matchups, you're not going to play her. And even then, she still has some utilities that she could use. For example, against Amber Steel, if you don't have Jim Hawkins, you can play Chicha on turn 2, and now your Chicha can give support to Belle and attack an opposing Daisy. I think Chicha is not only an early game play, you could always play her in the mid game, but if you have Quill out, and always refill your hand as well. Following Chicha, we have 3 copies of Jim Hawkins. I think in this very dominant steel meta that we are in with the 4 strength, 4 willpower, Jim Hawkins is just super cracked. Just because he can kill opposing daisies, kill opposing Scrooges, attack locations as well. I think him prioritizing over a turn 2 ramp is more efficient, because if you ignore the daisy and focus on getting a Scrooge out on turn 3, you're kind of putting yourself in a position to maybe getting, counter spelled, or even then, the daisy has already gained 2 to 6 lore, when really all you have to do is stop the bleeding a little bit early on, and that way you can always catch up. Since we're a little bit more quill focused, playing that gym on turn 2 is fine, because again, you can play characters for free like Belle or Scrooge later in the mid game. We have 4 copies of Belle. Pretty self-explanatory. You want to play Belle turn 1 into aggro decks. Again, into Ruby Sapphire, it depends. If you know that you're playing against it, maybe like game 2 or game 3, you want to have 2 popsicles or at least 2 1-drop items as well, because the Belle can get away with 3 to 5 lore against Ruby Sapphire, and if they want to answer it, they usually have to commit a little Sisu and a coil to kill a Belle, and that's huge for us. I think Belle is super strong right now in the meta, just because you get to play cards like Strength of the Raging Fire. This card being able to just target for 3 to 4 is super strong. Personally, I wasn't a fan of it at the beginning of the set, but after testing and trying it out, honestly, this card is broken. You might be wondering why we're not playing any Storm of the Raging Fire and we're playing Fire the Cannons instead. I think Storm of the Raging Fire just doesn't kill anything. It only kills 2 drops, and in 2 drops, that's pretty much only relevant into purple decks. And some purple decks are playing Diablo. If they're not playing Diablo with Emerald on their side, then they're playing Steel. And either way, they're still committing to a 1-drop play. So I think Fire the Cannons just fits way better. You don't have to rely on having Belle to play Let the Storm the Rage on. But I think Belle is just super strong on her own. But you do pair Strength of the Raging Fire with her, and you have a very strong plan for defense, which is something that was lacking in previous sets. And now with Jim Hawkins, Belle, we have a very strong early game into Amber Steel, into Purple Steel, into pretty much anything aggro. 2 copies of Pete. You might be thinking, hey, there's a lot of steel right now. You said we're against Ruby decks. Why aren't you playing more copies than Pete? And honestly, I think Pete, for at least this deck and the way that the deck draws, you're fine at 2 copies because you don't really want to see him early game. You want to see him later in the mid game. He can be replaced with Cogsworth. Cogsworth is a card that we are not playing, but I think they both serve the same purpose against steel decks. I just like being able to play Pete with Lore Ink. And against Ruby decks, when they do play Be Prepared, Pete just comes up very strong. The unfortunate thing is you don't really have enough ink early on to play like Tamatoa and Pete. So usually, again, if your crab does get to live, slamming down a Pete the following turn is always the way to go. You could play 3 copies of Pete if you wanted to, but me personally, I think 2 is just fine. 4 copies of Hiram, best card in the deck. You do not need to ban this card. If you guys want to ban or nerf a card, that should be Sapphire Coil, but Hiram, 4 copies, pretty self-explanatory, best card in the deck to keep our draw engine going. We have 4 copies of Scrooge McDuck. At first, I was a little iffy on this card, but honestly, being able to play cards for free is just broken. The 4/4 stat line is very strong into the steel meta that we're in, and having a backup plan other than Hiram for after you turn to ramp is just way better than the Grand Matala, because that 3/3 stat line just didn't do it. And now with Scrooge being 4/4 on play, being able to find an item to give it to Hiram as fodder is very strong. And what combos really well with Scrooge is once you have your 6-drop Tamatoa, you can play Scrooge and find that lucky dime as fast as you can to close out the game. You don't always want to go turn 3 Scrooge into certain matchups. So having that flex spot again of Chicha, Jim, Belle, Scrooge, like our early game is just super strong, and really against anything steel, you do want to play Scrooge if you're on the draw, but on the play you always want to go Hiram just because of that card advantage is insane. And then we're playing one of the MVPs in the deck, 4 copies of Tamatoa, the new set 7 legendary card. This card is just very consistent when it comes to keeping your draw power, keeping that engine going, being able to grab 2 items back from your discard. This what makes no new world type of playstyle for Sapphire and Steel way more better. It got a huge upgrade, and just being able to keep on continuing drawing and not having to play a card like a whole new world. I think this Tamatoa, for what you want to do against these Ruby Sapphire decks, is just play him and eight drop Tamatoa back to back. You want to force that pressure onto your opponents as well as the mirror match. In the mirror match against other Sapphire and Steel decks, you always want to make sure you put the threat out first if you can, because once your opponent starts playing on the defense, that's where you have the advantage. And really, that's what the whole game plan is into Ruby Sapphire, into these mirror matches. Other than playing Amber Steel or Purple Steel, is you want to just throw out these crabs as fast as possible and ramp. In the scenarios where you don't want to do that, for example, against Amber Steel or Purple Steel, you just want to make sure you have an early defense game plan, being able to stop the lure, and then again, you close out with the crabs later on in the game. Our next card that we're playing is 2 copies of Hades. I personally love Hades since the beginning of the game. I think Hades is such a strong card. It's Sapphire's Maleficent Dragon. It's our best removal tool that we have. With all the Pete's going around, all the crabs going around, Cogsworth going around, Hades is just able to send something on the board into the inkwell directly. I know some people aren't really a fan of this because of the uninkable slot. You could run Let It Go if you wanted to. Let It Go is very strong, especially if you're playing Cogsworth. But for me personally, I like the tempo that Hades brings to the table. He is a 3/6 body. He can quest for 2, and then he can sing our other action songs as well. I think Hades is just really good. You could do a 1-1 split with Let It Go or Arthur if you wanted to do something like that. But me personally, I think if you're not playing Hades, that it's incorrect. Followed by Hades, we're playing 4 Big Tamatoa. This card is just super good, forcing your opponent to have to answer it. And against Ruby Sapphire, which is probably our hardest matchup, all we have to do again really is just put out threats back to back. We're not going to be able to answer their stuff more efficiently, so we just have to force them to answer our stuff. You can get into a resource battle with them with Chicha and Hiram, and the good thing about Chicha with Quill is you're able to make sure you get to that Tamatoa on turn 6 while keeping a good hand size. I think you could cut down the copies of Tamatoa if you wanted to play Ariel. I know Ariel right now, other Sapphire and Steel players are on Ariel, some aren't, just because of how annoying the Ruby Sapphire deck could be. And Ariel does have wards, so they just always have to be prep, and a lot of Ruby Sapphire decks are dropping be prep. But me personally, I think the unequal slot for Ariel is not worth it. If I still have trouble with Ruby Sapphire, I'd probably look at a card more like Cusco or something like that before I hop into Ariel. But I mean, I'm not sure yet. I think so far right now with Chicha, she's been putting in the work that she needs. But if you do have issues into Ruby Sapphire, I do recommend try fitting Ariel, at least 2 copies, into this list. Now for the actions, we're playing 2 copies of Fire the Cannons. This might come to a surprise to a lot of people. Hey, how come this is not Let's Storm the Rage On? But as I explained earlier, I think Let's Storm the Rage On doesn't really have any good targets right now for the meta. And then I don't want to be forced to keep it in my mulligan or having to have Belle to sing it. I think Fire the Cannons is just very strong. It curves really well with Sell the Azurite Sea or as a backup turn 1 play. And you don't lose tempo with it just because, again, if you go turn 1 Fire the Cannons, turn 2 item, and then play a Belle, you've already caught up on the board. I think that you also have to respect Diablo. Diablo is very annoying, and you do not want to lose to a card that you just couldn't answer. So I think 2 copies of Fire the Cannons is fine, but you could replace that with Let's Storm the Rage On if you prefer that instead. We're playing 4 copies of Sail the Azurite Sea. Very, very, very strong ramp card. Better than Tipo in this list, just because with Chicha, we want to make sure we keep drawing cards. I don't hate playing 1 copy of Tipos, 2 copy of Tipos if you can find it in the list, just because always securing ramp in general is always good. But I think you just have to mulligan for your fishbone, for your ramp, and have to send everything back. It's really hard to depend on having to keep Hiram in your mulligan, but you always got to make sure you have your main game plan. And I think Sell the Azure IC just fits that really well. Tipo does pair really good with Belle and Strength of the Raging Fire. It's something that I do think the deck would be a little bit more powerful with. But for right now, the 4 copies of Sell and 4 copies of Fishbone Quill have been just good enough. We're playing 3 copies of the Vision of the Future. I am a huge believer of Visions. I'm always on 4 copies, so to my own surprise, I'm playing 3 copies of Vision, but I had to make the space somewhere. And I think with the new Tamatoa and Chicha, you're able to draw your cards a little bit more faster, and then you have a card like Scrooge that can find your popsicles, find your dimes. So I think losing 1 copy of Visions of the Future is fine, but again, with this card in particular, I think it's incorrect if you don't play any copies. It's very strong into finding your answers in the mid and late game. You're never playing this card early. This card, just think of it as being able to find, again, your answers late in the game. It can be offense or defense. 4 copies of Strength of the Raging Fire. I think this card should be nerfed, should be hit. It's just super, super good into early game Belle and to opposing decks, killing anything with 3 or 4 willpower. I really love this card over Let the Storm the Rage on. I think in a combination with 3 copies of Zeus, having the 2 Hades as well, we have a lot of removal tools for big bodies, and that's what this deck pretty much has adapted to from the last set. If you notice, we're not playing Tinkerbell or Swords. Those cards just feel a little bit more slower now. We have action cards that we can sing with lower cost characters, and with Strength of the Raging Fire, being able to snipe bigger threats, and then having Belle and Scrooge that can come out for free to answer little threats, kind of just makes Swords and Tinkerbell fall off. I don't mind putting Grab Your Swords back in just because there is a lot of Amber Emerald coming back in the deck, coming back in the meta, a lot of Amethyst Emerald as well. I could see 1 copies of Swords coming in. Probably replacing the Fire of the Cannons. Depending on your local meta, you can change the ratio with Zeus and Strength of the Raging Fire. If you do have issues with those decks and you can play 2 copies of Swords, I would definitely play that over Tinkerbell for the current format. And again, 3 copies of Zeus, being able to snipe opposing Tamatoas, 6 drops, just super strong for this 4 strength, this 4 willpower meta. I think being able to play Zeus on turn 4 after you ramp into Hiram or Scrooge, if you opened up a sale turn 2, is a very strong tempo play. And then to finish off the deck, we're playing our item package, 4 copies of Popsicle, 4 copies of Fortisphere, 4 copies of Quill, and 2 copies of Lucky Dime. Pretty standard in all the lists that you see. You don't want to play any less 1-drop items. I know some people are playing the 1-drop Shield and the 1-drop Last Cannons. I think those cards are super techy. You can... I don't mind those cards. I think those cards are really good in their own scenarios. Me personally, I just want to go for consistency. But if you did put those items in, I wouldn't blame you. That's a very good backup choice. So again, the overall strategy in this deck is if you're going to go against anything steel, you want to set up your Jim Hawkins on turn 2. And then you can always afford to fall back behind in tempo when you play Quill, because you can play cards for free like Belle and Scrooge in the mid game and just get back that advantage that you lost earlier. And then against Ruby decks, you want to start off with that Chicha or Quill. Chicha is just super strong into Ruby Sapphire because they're just forced to answer it. And then in both mirror matches and Ruby Sapphire, the main game plan is to always play a Hiram, play a Quill, and then start dropping your big drop 8 Tamatoa as fast as you can, back to back. Against these decks, you want to make sure that they answer you first. You always want to apply the pressure, apply the threat, because if you start responding to them, you fall back behind. And if you do have to respond to them, that's why singing or playing a card like Hades where you don't lose tempo is just really good in this format. Other than that, against anything that's Purple Steel, Amethyst Emerald, you can really just play the deck in a very defense and offense way. Again, Hiram is just super strong, being able to keep recurring cards. And then you have Belle, Scrooge that can fight the boards. And with all the other removal tools that the deck has, you can pretty much answer anything with just going blow for blow, pretty much. That sums up the deck list. I hope you guys enjoyed the deck profile. Again, let me know what you guys think of it in the comments. I think Sapphire and Steel is in a very well positioned spot in the meta right now, at least this build in particular. You have a very strong early defense and a very good closing out offense game, and you have a bunch of multiple routes that you can go on turn 2 with a card like Chicha, Jim, or just focusing on ramp and then playing out a very strong card like Hiram or Scrooge the following turn. And then you have all these access to removal and tools that you can use to combat the meta.